groupishness, and I begin by doing a sort of rather human kind of thing, which is to thank a lot of people. So, thank you to everybody in the Tanner Foundation for the great honor of giving these lectures, to the discussants for participating, and multiple collaborators here. And I want to mention one in particular. There seems to be rather a slow function. There we go. Chris Bowen, whose name you will hear quite a lot this evening, and the originator of much of what I'm going to talk about. And he died about 3 months ago, rather suddenly. So if I could dedicate this, it would be to him. Joel, I'm getting a slow response. Okay. My aim today is to talk about groupishness, and then tomorrow, well, tomorrow, in talking about patriarchy, there was an arrow symbolizing the fact that one lecture leads to another. They are actually meant to be set up in a way that has a logical sequence. Okay, so what is groupishness? Groupishness is kind of the opposite of selfishness. And the definition I've used here, the critical thing about it is that it's a set of psychological tendencies underlying behavior that appears to transcend genetic self-interest in favor of a larger group. So this is the kind of thing that happens when children or adults are offered an opportunity to get something and they prefer to share it with others. They prefer inequity, even if it's equity, even if it's disadvantageous to themselves. Humans are the only groupish primate. This is a unique phenomenon as far as our close relatives go, symbolized here by the fact that if you put a bunch of chimpanzees or any other primate into a fruit tree, then they will all collect their own fruit individually. Nobody would think of trying to collect some fruit in an efficient way, such as shaking it down so that others can collect it, because they'll be taken advantage of. Humans are the only species that has these kinds of groupish tendencies, temporarily unselfish. You see these tendencies emerging in infancy. You see a little chain here of increasing generosity towards others, done in a series of psychological experiments. So what humans are groupish, but of course they're also selfish. We have the motivations that every other animal does. And that fits right into the concept of Emil Durkheim that humans can be characterized as homo duplex. We are both selfish and we are groupish. And note that there's an antagonism between these two phenomena, because to be groupish means that you are foregoing your selfishness and vice versa. So humans are unusual in having sort of permanent tension, inner tension, between two potential states. Where does groupishness come from? I've listed 3 possibilities here. Most people tend to focus on norm psychology, or even treat norm psychology as groupishness. I'm using groupishness here in a way that is not, I would say, canonical, but what I'm trying to do is to organize the way we think about these prosocial tendencies. So I'm adding to the typical way of thinking about this 2 other features, collective effervescence and value psychology. Norm psychology has been recognized for a number of years. The idea here is you've got a set of adaptations for dealing with norms, for inferring and remembering and enforcing and conforming to moral norms. So this is something that is innate in the sense that there's a preparedness for it. So a norm here is a principle or a rule that specifies actions that are required and permissible or forbidden. And the kind of adaptations for norm psychology that people think about, and these are things that you do not find in chimpanzees, and many of them have actually been tested, is using moral norms having a conformist tendency, having a conscience, feeling shame, and being concerned about reputation, being concerned about what others see when you are in a moral dilemma and choose one route or another. So norm psychology is fairly standard. I'd like to marry into groupishness the concept of collective effervescence, which comes from Durkheim. He calls it here an amplified sense of union with others when a group of people experience something emotional together. And two ways of thinking about this. Adaptations for collective effervescence can be the fact that collective gatherings promote this love, agape, self-transcendence, and positive social beliefs in everybody. And movement synchronization, dancing in time, is known also to promote openness to others and a reduction of self-boundaries. So these are groupish moves that are independent of norm psychology. And then, given the brief of the Tanner Foundation, I think it's worth drawing attention to a speculative point, which is that maybe there's a value psychology as well that we come with. So this would be a set of adaptations for acquiring and being influenced by values, where values are different from norms because they're general ideals, desirable trans-situational goals that serve as guiding principles in people's lives, and they influence the acceptability of norms. So there may be a number of sources of groupishness. The great documenter of human values, Shalom Schwartz, says that there are, he finds from cross-cultural surveys, 10 basic human values that are found in general across different societies. And I think it's rather interesting that these can be divided just half in half into those that are selfish and those that are groupish. And so here we have the possibility of values that were selfish evolving prior to the evolution of groupishness, and then groupish ones' values being tacked on. So I've suggested that the way to think about this unique phenomenon of humans compared to other animals is through three lenses: a norm psychology, collective effervescence, and value psychology. And that groupishness is one of at least two other sources of the phenomenon that many of us are ultimately interested in, which is where did humans' ultra-cooperation come from? So that includes both the cognitive skills that allow people to get together and organize sophisticated systems of punishment or reciprocity, and cultural selection at the group level. All right, so the question I'm going to focus on is, how did groupishness evolve? And I'm going to be very rude to my colleagues by dismissing alternative ideas with a wave of a hand. The two major kinds of ideas are that multi-level selection can be responsible for groupishness, or mutualism, meaning that as individuals become smarter and smarter, they are able to devise more and more cunning, as it were, mutualistic ways to get benefits out of being unselfish. And in both cases, I think the fundamental problem is this, that the constraints on selfish behavior are not explained. These solutions have still failed to produce a clear answer to why it is that an individual who just resists all that, who remains intensely selfish, should not benefit. So the third major area that people have, and when I'm thinking about the evolution of cooperation among non-kin, I'm thinking across life here, not just the behavior of primates, is enforcement, where something is done to inhibit the ability of the selfish individuals to take advantage of whatever power they have. And enforcement turns out to be quite a powerful mechanism for understanding the evolution of cooperation at a variety of levels, and I'm going to suggest that it works for groupishness. Okay, so that was the first part of this talk. That was introducing you to the concept of groupishness. And now I want to go to two chunks, talking about what I'm calling the execution hypothesis for how and why groupishness evolved, and then talk about how self-domestication can be understood as a way to elaborate or to understand better the evolution of groupishness. So the discovery about 50 years ago that underlies much of this is that it has been a human universal for capital punishment to be part of the way that society works. Keith Otterbein was the first to really explore this, and it happens in state societies, although increasingly there are moves to stop execution. And it also happens among hunter-gatherers, such as these people in Australia. And this is a slide that I guess is not very easy to see right now, but it reflects the effort by Christopher Boehm to really investigate the hunter-gatherer literature in great detail. And he worked with almost 100 ethnographies concerning 50 different societies of foragers who he thought of as late Pleistocene appropriate because they had no horses, they had nomadic ways of life, and so on. And he collected from those ethnographies a series of cases of capital punishment. And what they show is that one of the more numerous categories is intimidating the group. An individual who intimidates through malicious sorcery or repeated murder, action otherwise as tyrant, and so on, are the ones particularly likely to be executed. Here is the execution hypothesis in its simplest form, as initiated by Chris Boehm. At some point in human evolutionary history, the ability to execute became something that meant that it could be done on a regular basis. And when that happened, it was combined with setting norms, and people killed the norm violators, and this selected genetically against selfish tendencies, norm-violating tendencies, and that leads to groupishness. So now I want to just take you through some of the evidence that underlies this. So non-human primates, group-living non-human primates, they always have an alpha male, and this alpha rank is achieved by a male defeating in physical combat, one-on-one, a previous alpha. And he does that by being very responsive to anybody who treats him disrespectfully. He's very quick to react, and react means use aggression to chase or hit or bite. It's very good to be an alpha male if you're concerned about your evolutionary success, because in numerous studies, the alpha male turns out to dominate genetic paternity. He gets a thoroughly disproportionate share of the subsequent paternities, meaning his behavior, his alpha male behavior, is positively selected. This is true even in the famously relatively unaggressive bonobos, where males are unable to, or they never do, coerce females, probably because they're afraid of them, but the alpha males actually have disproportionately high fitness, even greater than in chimpanzees, according to the current samples. Homo sapiens, we sometimes think of ourselves as having alpha males, we jokingly refer to the presidents as alpha males and so on, but we don't have alpha males. We either have obviously egalitarian relationships in which all of us are leaders, or in larger societies, we have alliances in which there is a leader, but the leader is the leader of an alliance. He hasn't personally, physically fought to get there, and he can be removed by his alliance, as Boris Johnson might well be in their future. So, as long as you've got an alpha male in charge, it is very difficult to see how you can get the evolution of groupishness. Why should the alpha male sacrifice himself? He's doing just fine. And if the others sacrifice themselves, how does that help? This was a point made by Freud, a long time ago, 1929, just as the first primate studies were beginning. Human life in common is only made possible when a majority comes together which is stronger than any separate individual and which remains united against all separate individuals. The power of this community is then set up as a right in opposition to the power of the individual, which is condemned as brute force. He's saying you have to get rid of the brute force in order to have what he called civilization. I want to just note at this point the awkwardness that I personally feel about the fact that we're going to be talking about these big issues of groupishness and patriarchy and so on. And in an ideal world, we would say, you know what? Both sexes are equally important in this particular evolutionary dynamic, because we're all very keen to make sure that we're not biased in seeing males as being more important. So the reason this is awkward is that I think this problem of controlling the alpha male is the key to the evolution of groupishness, and therefore that male behavior is, in fact, in this particular incident, primarily responsible for the evolution, I mean, obviously, of patriarchy, but of groupishness as well, and I'll be saying Homo sapiens. Well, evolution doesn't always do what you want it to. It would be the summary of that point. Okay, so the question is, how do you get rid of the alpha male? Because it's really important to be able to do so if you're going to envisage selection in favor of self-sacrificial cooperation. And from Boehm surveys and from Audubon surveys and from others, it's quite clear what the story is, that in societies in where you don't have any kind of police force, you don't have prisons, you don't have anyone to have recourse to solve a problem, you sometimes do get individuals who are bullies, tyrants, despots, who do unthinkable things, who will go up to another man and say, you know what, I'd like your wife tonight. I beg your pardon. And then all of a sudden, there's a fight. Doesn't happen that often, but nevertheless, there are sufficient numbers of cases that we know exactly what the answer is, which is that after days, weeks, months, sometimes years of putting up with it, eventually the society says, we've tried ostracism, we've tried shouting songs of derision in his face, we've tried reason, persuasion, laughing at him, whatever. He just carries on being horrendous. So then he's executed. Meaning that the killing is commonly approved. Sometimes the communal approval happens before, and sometimes it happens after the killing, but when that's the case, it's clear that the killer's expected to be approved. So this is very important. It solves the problem of these persistently violent individuals, and it does so in a particular style of aggression, which we'll call proactive. So proactive aggression is planned aggression that does not take place in the heat of emotion, but instead is planned to the point where the killers can be absolutely sure that they're not going to be the objects of fighting back. So it's safe for them. It's very low cost to be able to do this. This is like the classic trope about the mafia, where you wait for the victim to get into the car next to the driver, and then two people from behind can put the wire around his neck and strangle him. It's totally safe at the time you do the killing. So it's safe for the killers, and this is people killing a physically intimidating individual who is using his physical power to get what he wants, to try and get what he wants. At this point, something very dramatic has happened in human evolution, because you've had the evolution of an ability to control life and death for everybody in the group. If you can kill the most intimidating male, you can kill anybody. So we've got a beta male alliance that has taken out the alpha male, and as it were, in the course of this, discovered this power that no other species has. So it's premeditated, means that it might happen when you're asleep. It might happen with an arrow in the back, but one way or another, you can't defend against it. So what this means is that if the species is capable of generating norms, then to violate the norms that are advocated by the beta-male alliance becomes exceedingly dangerous. And the only protection is conformity, is doing what they suggest. Here's an example of norm violation. Men often have secret ceremonies in hunter-gatherer societies, and here we see a case where two women steal up to the ceremonial ground and watch the men blowing the trumpet, go back to the women's camp and tell them what they'd seen. When the men came back to camp and heard of their behavior, the leader said, "When will we kill them?" Everyone said, "Immediately." And the two women were instantly put to death by members of their own clan with the help of the men from the other group. Execution is often done by your close relatives, because then that reduces the chance that there will be revenge killings afterwards. So I want to suggest that once the beta males have this power of life and death over everyone in the group, then they can set two types of norm, and one type of norm is good for the group as a whole, such as, you know what, when some people are short of food, we should make sure that everyone gets to share. Or let's make sure that we don't have conflict that's unnecessary. But other kinds of norms are beneficial just to the males who propose them. And those would be things like males dominating females and married men being able to dominate bachelors. So I'll be going more there next time. So in support of this notion, it's a familiar conclusion of experiments with understanding moral tuitions, that people tend to make moral decisions that minimize their own personal responsibility. And Jonathan Haidt, who's studied this in depth, here's a quote from him which sums it up. The first rule of life in a dense web of gossip is be careful what you do. And the second rule is you better be able to frame your actions in a positive light. Plausible deniability seems a very strong principle of moral decision-making, which is understandable if we come from a history where it's been very dangerous to challenge norms. And the essential argument that I would make for our species is an example from Mary Douglas here. Just as the Azande conform to a high standard of good manners for fear of being accused of witchcraft, which can often lead to execution, so with the lily, the danger of being accused of sorcery encourages a modest, placatory demeanor in older men. If you're living in a world in which when people start whispering about you and saying, you know, he's starting to act a bit funny and he hasn't really been much help recently, and you know, then it's very, very dangerous to go down that path of being an outcast. So the execution hypothesis is that our species at some point acquires this unique ability to execute. They then kill the norm violators. When I say they, the males in control of the execution who have executed the alpha male. And that selects against norm violating tendencies, and that leads to groupishness. So that's part one. Part two is human self-domestication as another consequence of execution, with its significance for understanding when this happened. Because once you have the ability to execute, then you can go, it has two effects. One we've talked about, groupishness. The other one is self-domestication. So now I'm going to talk about why it is that we can look at the different kinds of data and conclude that humans are a species that has undergone selection against reactive aggression, which is what happens in domesticated animals, and produced a domesticated version compared to our wild ancestors. So I'll begin this by emphasizing this point that I just made earlier, which is that only humans can execute. And I think there's been some confusion about this point, because it is the case that chimpanzees do go off on raids into neighboring territories, and they do kill members of neighboring groups. But what they don't do is kill members of their own group in a way that is like human execution. I emphasize this because Chris Boehm thought otherwise, and I think we've now got new evidence, and he now agrees that this is unique to humans. Within group killings do occur in chimpanzees, but they're not executions because there's no evidence of planning. You see them evolving out of a brawl, basically. So it's by reactive aggression, and it's not killing of alpha males. It's killing of low-rank or mid-rank males. This makes sense because execution requires some kind of agreement among the killers as to who to kill and who's going to join us in doing this. It requires conspiracy. And you can't have conspiracy if you can't talk to each other. So I don't see any way that non-humans like chimpanzees can carry out a commonly approved execution. What humans do is to invoke what I'm calling targeted conspiratorial killing. It's targeted because they've decided to kill an individual, the alpha male or somebody else. And it's conspiratorial because in this world in which suspicions can lead to very dangerous outcomes, you have to conspire very delicately to be able to be sure that those who you are trying to recruit into an attack on somebody scary are people that you can trust. So I think it takes quite sophisticated language to be able to do that. Okay, so once you have execution, then I think it's reasonable to say that what you're doing is leading to evolutionary selection against reactive aggression. And that's based on the fact that from the cultural descriptions that we have, execution does select against the most violent and selfish individuals. More males than females are executed in the cross-cultural record, up to a remarkable 24% of males dying by execution in the Djibouti that Bruce Nauf studied. And I've been in correspondence with him and said, do you think this was just the result of some sort of temporary burst? And he's got a lot of evidence that this was actually happening for a long time. This is going on for decades. So this can be a very serious problem. The consequences of execution are primarily beneficial for the males, because they are the ones who are getting rid of male competitors. Whether or not it benefits females is another matter, and will be very important eventually to bring that story in. It's conducted mainly by males, and it's approved by mainly male community consensus. Okay, well now, we're also worried about aggression, that you might think that humans are a somewhat aggressive species, but Aristotle didn't think so, and many thinkers over the last 2 millennia have not thought so, because they have drawn attention to the fact that in some ways humans seem similar to a domesticated animal, because we are so tolerant, we are so slow to arouse compared to wild animals, but not domesticated animals. And here's some data just comparing us with chimpanzees. So on the left, you see a rate of physical aggression per 1,000 hours among chimpanzees from 2 different study sites, and you see there's variation, but nevertheless, it's all quite high. And on the right, you see some estimates from a particularly disturbed and alcohol-using population in Arnhem Land, which has probably got a particularly high rate of aggression. So this suggests that humans have something between 2 and 3 orders of magnitude lower rates of aggression, reactive aggression, than chimpanzees. And you see here, Kim Hill, having studied the Arte for 43 years, never saw a scuffle among them. We're very, very suppressed in these ways. So that suggests that at some point there's been selection against reactive aggression in our species, and then the question would be when? Did it happen tens of millions of years ago, or did it happen in the recognizable past? When did we come on this track of having very little aggression compared to wild animals? And that's where the experiments by Belyaev and others come in. So Belyaev in the 1950s started experimenting with foxes that had already been subject to a certain amount of inadvertent selection for tameness, because they'd been in captivity for 50 years. And he took these and selected for low reactive aggression in order to basically see what was going to happen. And here's what happened. You got the domestication syndrome. So the domestication syndrome is the syndrome that Darwin drew attention to, which is that animals of unrelated phylogenies, if they are domesticated, have a series of similarities to each other. Dogs, cats, horses, goats, when they're domesticated, many of the individuals have white patches of fur. Many of them have floppy ears, and so on. So those are 2 traits in the domestication syndrome. They're unpredictable as to whether or not they will occur in particular individuals or in particular species. But for reasons that are only slowly beginning to be understood, when you domesticate, you develop a domestication syndrome. And what Belyaev showed was that when he selected for low reactive aggression in his foxes, you got a domestication syndrome. So this is an extraordinary experiment, because what it shows us is that if you see the domestication syndrome, then that's a signal that there has been selection against reactive aggression. It's the only way we know to produce it. Okay, well, the claim I will now make is that we show the domestication syndrome. And the basis of this is that these 4 features in the top left are features that archaeologists use to recognize domesticated animals when they find them in fossil layers. So you find a dog-like animal from 10,000 years ago, and you say, is it a dog or is it a wolf? And what you have to do is to compare it on these 4 criteria. And if it's got, compared to wolves, a relatively light body, short face, small teeth, dogs not so much with the feminization, and brain reduction, then it's a domesticated version. And all of these things are features that you find in Homo sapiens compared to our earlier ancestors. The brain reduction, as I note, is only recently. The pattern of change is something we won't get into, and it's something that people haven't really studied in any kind of detail yet. Which of these domestication syndrome traits come in at different periods and how intensely and so on. So that's something very much for the future. But meanwhile, what we can say is that they do seem to be associated with aggression. And I'll give one example of the face narrowing. You see here the face narrowing from 300,000 years ago up to the present. So I have a picture of hockey players here because of a study involving hockey players, and it was kind of a neat study because what it's doing is looking at the amount of time that the players spend in the penalty box for fighting. And the ref who puts them into the penalty box only sees people who've got helmets on, so probably can't see the width of their face too much, and anyway, it's unlikely that he's biased by the width of their face. And what the studies by Justin Carey and his colleagues have shown is that there is a persistent small relationship between the relative width to height ratio of the face and the number of minutes they spend in the penalty box in 6 different teams. Now, there's lots of variance here, so none of these individual graphs is convincing. So partly what that's saying is that those individuals who got relatively wide faces in this audience, I'm not worried that they're just suddenly going to attack me. There's lots of variation. But nevertheless, this is 6 professional teams. They went on and then looked at 6 college teams, and the same pattern just repeatedly occurs. And in fact, there's a cottage industry now looking at the relationships between aggression and the facial width-height ratio, and you find that in all sorts of ways, there is evidence of a gentle trend for the wider-faced men, but not women, to be more aggressive. And this cuts across race. It's true there. It's true in the way that individuals recognize each other as more threatening if they are wider-faced, and so on. So I'm expecting that other components of the domestication syndrome will have the opportunity to be tested in similar ways in relationship to aggression. As far as facial width goes, here are modern humans at the top compared with 2 of our extinct relatives, Denisovans and Neanderthals. And you see that both of those had the wider faces. So when we look at the evidence for Homo sapiens being a domesticated species, then so far there is no evidence of any other species of Homo being domesticated, having undergone this selection for reduced reactive aggression that would lead to the domestication syndrome. And one exciting area is to look at the genetic evidence. As I said, it's still a growing area for understanding what genetic changes happen when you select for a domesticated species. But an area that is getting a lot of traction, I think, is the notion that you change the migration of the pattern of migration of neural crest cells in ways that have multiple influences on the rest of the body. And in some cases, this is really well known, like the production of melanin, and in others, it's more speculative. And if you now look at the pattern of changes between wild ancestors and domesticated species, you find that there's considerable evidence emerging that these, call them domestication genes, found in Homo sapiens, they're not in Neanderthals or Denisovans, and being preliminarily dated between 500 and 300,000 years ago. So I infer from this that Homo sapiens, there has been selection against reactive aggression, and that the alpha males have been selected against. We are now no longer have fighting alpha males. We were looking for the time when there was selection that brought humans down to this low rate of aggression, and we seem to be seeing this with the origin of Homo sapiens, because that's the point 300,000 years ago at which we first see the tentative steps towards the more gracile version that we are today. So the logic here is that the ability to execute led to the ability to kill these alpha behaving males. That selects against reactive aggression, and that produces the self-domestication syndrome. And so this seems to me to be a rather nice support for Boehm's concept of execution being responsible for groupishness. So let me bring this together a little bit. The aim here has been to try and understand how it is that Homo sapiens is groupish, and to think about a time in the past when this was not true. And what I've said is that that time would have been a time when, instead of having nice males who can all sit around today and not compete to be the physical alpha, thank you males, it would have been a time when we actually did have bully alpha males. The question is, when was that time? Chris Boehm summarized so one aspect of his theory here. The theory I propose can be put very simply, or put this very decisive brand of egalitarianism, cooperation, so firmly in place was the ability of politically unified groups to outlaw and punish resented alpha male behavior. There had to be selection against alpha male behavior before you can get groupishness. And I'm saying that self-domestication supports the execution hypothesis and pins it down, I think, to 300,000 years ago, events that happened shortly before then. Some people have raised a problem that how can you invoke aggression in the form of execution to select against aggression in the form of alpha male behavior? And I mentioned that we have two different types of aggression: proactive aggression basically being used for execution, and reactive aggression being the type that is being selected against. And I think that the fact that only humans are capable of this targeted conspiratorial killing explains why this happened in us and not in species like chimpanzees, which are very close in some ways. They are capable of coordinating to kill another individual, but they can't do it within a social group where the alliances are unpredictable, as opposed to when they're attacking a member of a neighboring group when the alliances are predictable. So the complete picture is this. And the question then would arise, well, what was responsible for the evolution of the ability to execute? And I've implied, I think it's right, that there would be improved language. And I think what this says is that by the time you reach 300,000 years ago, when you're starting to see selection against reactive aggression, that language must have got to the point of being so sophisticated that they could handle the kind of conspiratorial juggling that you need to organize an execution. And that, I think, means that we have history going back 300,000 years in the form of establishing some kinds of institutionals that have really affected humans. This chain starts, and then from Homo sapiens, there would be feedback, because once you get Homo sapiens that is showing groupishness, is having reduced aggressiveness, then they're going to find it all the easier with every passing generation to be able to conspire together and form this tyranny of the cousins, as Ernest Gellner called it. So I see an accelerating pattern here, and it would be wonderful to be able to test that with the fossil record eventually in terms of the rate of accumulation of domestication syndrome traits, and ultimately perhaps leading to an explanation of how it is that Homo sapiens became rather suddenly very effective cultural species, more like 40, 50, 60,000 years ago. What I've described here is clearly got its speculative aspects. Against it, you can say that we're talking with a very broad brush when we talk about humans as a self-domesticated species and starting 300,000 years ago and then just gradually gathering pace. And I fully acknowledge that we're not able with this to explain the evolution of language, even though once the system gets going, then language evolution can be imagined to accelerate. And clearly we don't know anything about the rates of execution in the past. But on the other hand, I think we can say why our biology resembles that of domesticated animals. There's been selection against reactive aggression. So that's why we have a low propensity for it. It's why humans have egalitarian male dominance hierarchies. We can say why humans are politically dominated by male alliances. Why life in small-scale society can be so claustrophobic and fearful of what people think about you, and ultimately why we cooperate so pro-socially. So what I'm suggesting is that if we look at here 4 million years of human evolution, we can think of self-domestication and groupishness emerging not totally de novo, but in a relatively sudden event, in parallel, right at the same time, at the origin of Homo sapiens. And I think the processes that I've been describing are going to be thoroughly influential in producing Homo sapiens itself from an earlier ancestor that some people call Heidelbergensis, that, according to this analysis, would have had alpha males and much less cooperation. And that leads us ultimately to questions I'll take up tomorrow about how the dynamics involved in groupishness led to a particular exaggeration of patriarchy in our species. I'll say again, thank you to the Tanner Foundation and my colleagues. Thank you.